And one of the things that we have on here is an Army publication where the military used to have educational material teaching people, certainly teaching their officers, what the difference was between a democracy and a republic. So, for some reason, oh, here it is. So you click on it. So this, yeah, they go into what citizenship is, and they point out that the citizenship always leads to a dictatorship or anarchy, but it does not lead to freedom. When you in a republic where you're sovereign, where you can suspend the rules on your own authority, so long as you do not impose on the sovereignty of someone else, well, that leads to freedom, because when the rules become obnoxious, you can just say, forget it, I'm not going to obey it. That's the beauty of a republic. And the founding fathers had a confidence in the public at large. They believed more in the people than they did in the specialists running government, because they knew how human nature is and how government nature is. So anyway, this is the publication by the military, very short. Training manual number 2000-25, and you just click on here, and we got a copy of it. It's on a it's in a word processor file. There it is. War Department, 1928. That was back when they believed in it. Yes. Okay, but anyhow, so they go into what citizenship is, and they go into all sorts of stuff, but as it relates to the military. But it's interesting, they no longer publish that manual, I understand, because basically they're trying to convert this over to a democracy. We go to the essay category on this CD. Under essays, I think this is where it is. We have, here we are. In 1792, Philip Freneau wrote an article in his newspaper on how to, he wrote the rules for changing a republic into a monarchy. And of course, the intermediate step would be a democracy. So he lays out the whole plan, and if you take the time to read it, you'll see that's exactly what they've done. The one thing that's happening today that was never anticipated by the founding fathers was the arrival of the internet, electronic communications. Never in the history of the world that we know of have we ever had the high-speed communications. And I'm sure a few of you, certainly I do, have a mailing list of people you send out interesting things to, jokes or whatever, and for communicating. Well, that's the power of the press, personalized. You can duplicate your thoughts and send them out en masse for a fraction of a cent. That's pretty good. So it's an interesting, knowing my history as I do, which isn't all that great, but the little bit of history I do know, I think there's an interesting race going on between the government doing its natural thing, which is taking over its own people, versus the people becoming awake and doing something about it before it happens. And I'm not sure which side's going to win, but I'll say one thing: the internet certainly upset the formula. Anyhow, so there's that. Back to the foundation here. Okay, when California was admitted to the Union, it had to be a republic. So here's a copy of the admission. And they say, whereas the people of California have presented a constitution and asked admission into the Union, which constitution was submitted to Congress by the President of the United States by message date February 13th, 1850, and which on due examination is found to be Republican in its form of government, be it enacted by, and so forth, and they went and admitted the state into the Union. So all the states have to go through this process because the Constitution for the United States demands it, mandates it. They have to be a Republican form of government before they can join. Let's talk about a court. What is a court? There's a couple of definitions. One of the definitions is legal, and the other one's practical. Okay? So, on the practical side, all a court is basically the sovereign sitting on his throne surrounded by his courtiers. You know, the people who gravitate to the center of power. So, the thing is that in the traditional perspective of what a king is or a dictator is, you have this story, this scenario. The king is sitting on his throne and he's looking out the window and he sees some knave out there stealing oranges off of his favorite orange tree. So he does the kingly thing. He sends the guard out, picks the guy up, throws him in the dungeon. Okay? That's all. Very simple. After all, he's the king. Well, what happens after that is on dungeon visiting day, the knave's brother visits him. And he complains to his brother about how unfairly he was treated. He really didn't, nobody heard his side of the story. And so it's unfair that he get 3 years of prison time, dungeon time, and so forth. And of course the brother, being a brother, is very sympathetic. And he says to him, yeah, that's a bad deal. He says, I'll take care of this for you. And that night, because the brother turned out to be the chief cook, the king dies of an overdose of arsenic. Yeah, that's all. That's how things got settled, you know, sometimes. Well, that's a bad deal for kings. So we got this court system. Now let's recast the scenario. King's sitting on his throne. He looks out the window, and he sees some knave stealing oranges off his favorite orange tree. So far, the story is the same. So he sends the guard out. The guard goes out, picks up the guy, brings him before it. They accuse him of doing this. They ask him how he pleads. They get the various witnesses. They set up the procedure. They make an announcement, a public announcement. We're going to have this trial on a certain date. Everybody shows up at the trial, including the knave's brother, the chief cook. And they have the trial. They present the evidence. And then they have a decision, if necessary. Maybe have a jury out there, you know, to look at it and so forth. Then they convict him, and then he gets his 3 years in the dungeon. Okay? Now, on dungeon visiting day, the brother visits the prisoner, and the prisoner complains about what an unfair deal it was, how he didn't really do it, and so on. And the brother says, look, bro, he says, I attended your trial. I saw the evidence. I said, you know, I'm sorry, but you kind of earned it. And so, as a consequence of that, the king gets to live another day, arsenic-free day. Okay? So what I'm pointing out here is that the number one purpose of a court, above all the other things that you've heard, all the things you've read about, all the court rules and procedures and everything else, the number one thing about a court is that it is a stage upon which the sovereign puts a show to convince the rest of the world that the sovereign is right. That's the purpose of a court. Okay? Nothing can violate that rule. I don't care what what goes on in the courtroom and so forth, that is the number one rule you never violate. You must put on a good show. I've had people ask me questions about doing certain procedures and so forth, and then I ask them, well, is that a good show? Does that convince the rest of the world that you're right? Well, it turns out it doesn't a lot of times. Just because you're legally right doesn't mean you're right in the public perception. And who is this public I'm talking about? Well, it's the court clerk, it's the sheriff, it's the marshal, it's the cops, it's the mayor of the city if the case is important enough for him to notice it, and so on. It's all these people who hold the guns. Okay, you want those people to be convinced you're right. Now, they may know they're doing wrong and taking your rights away on purpose, but the first step is to have them know you're right. Now, when they know you're right and they're wrong, that takes a little bit of steam out of their efforts. Okay? There's something about us humans that in general we tend to limit ourselves. Just like I told you the story earlier about the Buddhist monk that was head of all the other monks. Nobody would kill him because they liked him. Okay? He knew how to run his court, so to speak. He knew how to keep things looking good so that as he did his damage, people held back. They didn't take retribution on him, even though he was a major problem internationally for the government. So that's the first consideration. A court is a stage upon which the sovereign conducts his show so as to satisfy the rest of the world that his decision is a good one. Now, sometimes you do find somebody not guilty, but basically you're the plaintiff, the sovereign plaintiff. You know what the person did to you. He knows what you did to you. I mean, between you know what the truth is. So why have the court? Well, it's because you're actually putting on a show for the rest of the world. So put on a good show, okay? Don't take shortcuts. It'll pay. So that's what a court really is, in practical terms. Now, there's all kinds of courts, okay? You know about admiralty courts, maritime courts, court of the exchequer, court of claims, all kinds of courts. But in America, there is only one court, and that's a court of record. All the other courts are what we call nisi prius courts. They are courts that exist because you failed to object. Okay?
And you call it what kind of court?
A nisi prius court. That translates from Latin into without prior objection. A nisi prius court is a court that exists because of no prior objection. Okay? So, and you'll see it's right here. You see it, I have it on the menu, nisi prius court. And one time, I got a letter from somebody objecting. And so I put his objection up on the website, and then I put my answer to it, describing a nisi prius court. It might be worth studying. But the important thing to understand about a nisi prius court is it's a court that exists without objection. So all those courts I mentioned are nisi prius courts. Another way, you could call them contract courts, but they're contracted because of your failure to object. See, you don't have to have an overt act to have a contract. I mean, an overt agreement. By the actions of the parties, you know there's a contract going on. If I give you some money and then I walk off and take your car, we never had an agreement to do that, but you accepted the money and I accepted the car. You gave me the keys. Even if we never spoke a word, you know that there's some meeting of the minds there. Some agreement, right? After all, you took the money and I took the car. So a contract can exist on nothing more than the action of the parties. You don't have to have it in writing. You don't have to have the words spoken or anything else. Just what you did. that shows there's a contract, an agreement,